Collecting classic retro video games in America has been a little crazy for the past couple of years. By that I mean crazy expensive. However, collecting classic retro video games in Japan is way different and way better. There are so many classic retro video games that are better, different, cooler, and way cheaper if you get the Japanese version instead. Buying Japanese games in the West is easier than it's ever been. In this video, I'm going to cover 5 Famicom games and 5 Super Nintendo games to show you what I'm talking about. In this video series, I'm going to point out what games are significantly cheaper to get a Japanese version, and what games are better than the Western version, and significantly cheaper is better. Personally, I think it's more fun to have slightly different versions of classic retro video games than other video game nerds in your town. There's a thrill in having the original Japanese cartridge, since they were often the original version that game developers created. I also think the smaller, colorful Famicom cartridges and slick, rounded Super Famicom cartridges are a lot more aesthetically pleasing than the big, blocky, gray NES and SNES cartridges. Nintendo allowed third-party game developers to manufacture their own cartridges in Japan, and as a result, Famicom cartridges have a greater variety of design and can allow third-party developers to use special chips. The American versions of these games had to have their special chips removed, and their cartridges were remarkably uniform and bland in design. Famicom games are a rainbow of creativity and fun. I'll also cover how to play them on the video game consoles that you probably already own, and I'm going to touch on if you need to know the Japanese language or culture to enjoy these games. I have been quite curious about Japanese games and enjoying them for just as long as I've been enjoying video games, and that's been for a very long time. I'm going to tell you about 5 8-bit Nintendo games on cartridge and 5 16-bit Nintendo games that many collectors would love to have sitting in their video game collection. All of the prices that I'm talking about were from May 2023 for loose cartridges, and that means no box, no manual. But that's how I roll and how I collect. You can play Famicom games on a US Nintendo NES or any US NES compatible clone console using a 60 to 72 pin adapter. I'll go over those later on in the video. Super Famicom games can be easily played in a US Super Nintendo or any US SNES compatible clone console. So let's get started. Ikuzo! Rockman, aka Mega Man. It's called Rockman because of rock and roll. The Famicom cartridge is light blue like the Blue Bomber, and there is an illustration of the titular hero fighting all of the other robot masters. Capcom's early genre-defining platform action game has fast action, amazing sprite work, and level design that set the bar and kept inspiring sequels for decades. I purchased a set of all 6 8-bit Rockman games for the Famicom for less than just 1 cart of the later American versions of the game. The Japanese cart-only price of Rockman 1 is roughly $35 to $44. The American cart-only price of Mega Man is $90 to $120. That's a price difference of $55 to $76. I give it a language-friendly rating of A+, all English text. And the regional differences? Japan got a better title screen. Capcom's mighty Final Fight from 1993 was often overlooked for 16-bit games, but it sports some of the absolute best sprite work and design that Nintendo's 8-bit hardware had seen. Capcom was an absolute master of Famicom game design by this point, but by using some of the more advanced memory mapper chips, they turned out a fun, fast, super deformed reimagining of Final Fight that is fast, colorful, cute, and fun to play. More like kawaii Final Fight. North American gamers gave up on the NES at a much quicker rate than Japanese gamers moved away from the Famicom. As a result, there are a lot more copies of the Famicom release of Mighty Final Fight in circulation. The Famicom cartridge is a very attractive bright red with really cute artwork that I think is a step up above the American release. There are some optional dialogue choices in untranslated Japanese, but if you select the wrong answer, it doesn't impact you. I've linked to a translation of the regional differences, including the correct answers. Mighty Final Fight by Capcom. The Japanese price is 3,800 yen, or $28, to 5,000 yen, $37. The American price, on the other hand, is $309 to $320, giving it a price difference of $281 to $283. I give it a language-friendly rating of B+. There's some optional dialogue in Japanese, but you can understand the story without it. And as far as regional differences, the Japanese version has some characters talking to you before the fight, but there's some bonuses for getting the correct answer, but there's no penalty for getting the wrong answer. There's an optional Japanese trivia quiz for bonuses before fighting Abigail that was not in the US version. There's a link to a guide in the video description. Hudson's second entry in the long-running and quite excellent legendary Bomberman series is a perfect example about how regional price differences are horrific if you only buy US games and are not down to getting the Famicom versions instead of the NES. The Bomberman 2 cartridge is a bright yellow with even better cartoon cover illustrations than the US airbrushed art. The game is almost identical except for the passwords changed, and they took out a cross on a church in the opening cutscreen since the US release was made when Nintendo had really strange no real religions rule during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Bomberman 2 by Hudson. The Japanese price, roughly $13, while the American price is $156 to $189. That's a price difference of $143 to $176. I give it a language-friendly rating, A+. No problems. The regional differences, there's almost none. There's a cross that was removed on the church in the US version. Simply put, Super Mario Bros. 3 is the greatest 8-bit game ever made. But the version that we got in the US was made way too easy when Mario will go back to Large Mario when hit by an enemy. This requires 3 enemy hits to die in the US version, while the original Japanese game, you go back to Small Mario when you have a Fire Flower, Raccoon Tail, or other power-ups, and Mario will lose a life after 2 hits from the enemy. This gives the Japanese version a much more decent challenge and a greater sense of accomplishment. Super Mario Bros. 3 by Nintendo. Japanese price, roughly $3 to $8. The American price, $20 to $25. Price difference, $17. Language friendly rating, A. Limited non-essential story text, but that's about it. Regional differences, oh, so many. The biggest being the difficulty. Super Mario Bros. 3 was made much easier for the US release. Life is like a hurricane. Especially if you're trying to track down an American version of DuckTales 2 by Capcom. However, the Japanese version is much easier to come by and is just as fun. Capcom really went out of their way to make some really good jumping action games on the Nintendo 8-bit hardware, and really used the Disney license to good effect. The 2 DuckTales games are regarded as some of the best games on the platform, and since Japanese gamers were playing 8-bit Nintendo hardware for much longer than American gamers were, it's easier to get a glorious purple cartridge containing DuckTales 2 for Famicom. Japanese price, $30 to $40. American price, $220 to $299. Price difference, $190 to $259. Wow. Language friendly rating, B+. The stage select screen, some character dialogue, and ending text is in Japanese, but if you've ever played through this game before, knowing the dialogue is not going to impact you. Also, there are some game facts walkthroughs and YouTube playthroughs if you really want to know what's said. Regional differences, none. Fun fact, DuckTales for Famicom was called Wanpaku Daku Yume Boken in Japanese, so if you're looking for a copy of it, look for Wanpaku Daku Yume Boken instead of DuckTales. It's pretty much impossible to find an American copy of Mega Man X2 or X3 for less than $100 these days. And that's very disappointing because they are some of the best 2D platformers with some really awesome sprite work that makes Nintendo's 16-bit hardware shine. The second and third Mega Man games on the Super Nintendo are exceedingly rare and pricey, but their Japanese versions are easy to find and are amazingly inexpensive. Also, there is the added chuckle of seeing some of the original names for some of the bosses. Personally, I don't play the Mega Man games for the story, I play them for the impeccable action, platforming, and if you're truly concerned that you might miss the story, again, you can find a playthrough of the English versions online. You can quite literally get a copy of the Japanese version for less than fast food lunch. Rockman X2, aka Mega Man X2 by Capcom, Japanese price $6. Or roughly $8. American price $120 to $147, giving a price difference of $114 to $139. Language friendly rating A. Limited non-essential story text, but that's about it. Regional differences, character names and weapon names were different, but in English. Super Metroid by Nintendo. Japan never actually got Famicom Metroid on cartridge, but instead the original game was only on the Famicom Disk System. But when Super Metroid was released for the Super Famicom, it really showed what Nintendo could actually do with their new 16-bit hardware. This is the game that really helped define the Metroidvania genre, up there with Dracula X and Symphony of the Night. Nintendo did international gamers a real solid by including the full English text as an option on the Japanese version, and they wouldn't get rid of any sort of console region lockings for the non-portable systems until the full release of the Nintendo Switch. So, Super Metroid is a really good entry into getting into the Japanese version of 16-bit Nintendo games. Also, many Japanese game stores clearly note which cartridges had had the batteries replaced. They describe it as battery service completed. Super Metroid by Nintendo, Japanese price $18 to $26. The American price $60 to $75, with a price difference of $42 to $49. Language friendly rating A++. Regional differences, Nintendo actually included the full English version on the Japanese cartridge, and they included the Japanese version on the English cartridge. So that's like negative regional differences. Excellent. Side-scrolling beat-em-ups have been a staple of 1990s video games, and the Final Fight series by Capcom were genre-defining entities. The Super Famicom exclusive Final Fight 2 is where they actually delivered on the promise of having two-player simultaneous gameplay. It really expanded on their character sprite work. In 1990s, Capcom really hit their stride with 16-bit games, and Final Fight 2 is no exception. The American version is quite literally 10 times the price of the Japanese version. Which, by the way, the Japanese version is uncensored. Again, I think I can follow the story. Bad guy is bad, so our heroes have to beat up all his goons. That's pretty much all the stories of these beat-em-up games. Final Fight 2 by Capcom, Japanese price, roughly $6 to $7. American price, $60 to $70, with a price difference of $54 to $63. Language friendly rating A. Limited non-essential story text, but that's about it. The regional differences, the US version is censored, but the Japanese version has enemy characters, more enemy characters holding weapons, and more female enemy characters. Akumajou Dracula for Super Famicom, aka Super Castle 4 by Konami. Pretty much anything Castlevania related has gotten ridiculously expensive in America in the recent years, and it's a crying shame because they are absolutely an essential buy for any 8 or 16-bit gamer who wants to play them on the original cartridge and really experience them. When I started collecting cartridges again, Akumajou Dracula for the Super Famicom was one of the first games that I actually played through, and it really taught me the joy of playing on authentic hardware again. And that by not having the save states and incredibly accessible conveniences of emulators gives you playing an experience of playing the original hardware, or at least clone hardware. It creates a tense experience with stakes really high because failure has real consequences. Konami's first 16-bit Castlevania has impeccable controls, amazing creativity, and one of the best soundtracks in a Castlevania game, and that's saying something. Akumajou Dracula, aka Super Castlevania 4 by Konami, has a Japanese price of roughly $18 to $19, and the American price is $48 to $55, with a price difference of $30 to $36. Language friendly rating, A. Limited non-essential story text, but that's about it. Regional differences. The US version removed a lot of blood and crosses, which is ironic considering the game is about fighting vampires and monsters. Super Mario Kart by Nintendo. Nintendo basically created the cartoony kart racer genre with Super Mario Kart, and the Japanese version of this essential Nintendo game has some unique differences in the sprite work for Yoshi, and Bowser and Peach both drink the champagne in the original Japanese version. This essential Mode 7 Nintendo classic really has cute illustrations on the Japanese cartridge, and besides some Japanese text on the menus, the game is completely accessible to an American gamer who doesn't know any Japanese. Well, the American cartridge isn't ridiculously expensive, but the Japanese version can be had for less than a latte. So if you're already placing an order for Japanese games, you could probably pick up Super Mario Kart for next to nothing. The Japanese price of Super Mario Kart by Nintendo, $3 to $8. The American price, $35 to $40, with a price difference of $32. Language friendly rating, A. Just the menus. Regional differences, Bowser and Peach both drink champagne after winning. Course names, character names were slightly different, and Yoshi's character sprite was drawn slightly different. Playing import Japanese games on US game systems. When Nintendo made the Famicom for the Japanese and Asian market, they used a 60-pin cartridge connector that didn't have any kind of copy protection. But they made sure to develop anti-piracy lockout chips on the 72-pin NES cartridges. They also made them much bigger and mostly empty plastic shells to continue the illusion that the Nintendo Entertainment System was akin to a VCR rather than a normal video game system. Many Famicom to NES adapters have their own lockout chips to try and fake out authentic Nintendo hardware into playing Japanese games. So, to play Famicom games on NES or compatible systems, you will need to use cartridge adapters. Hyperkin makes a really good one that can handle many larger Famicom cartridges in a front-loading NES, and it can handle any weird-shaped Famicom cartridge on a top loader. This one uses a ribbon to retrieve the cartridge. It is an updated version of the old Honeybee adapter, which was the old only way to play Famicom games on the NES in the 80s and 90s. The labels of the cartridge face the back on a top loader or down in a front loader NES. My Arcade made one that has a handle and fits the general design of an American Nintendo cartridge. It has the Famicom games facing the front on a top loader or facing up on a front loader NES system. However, it can't handle weird-shaped cartridges. Old School Games has an adapter that is similar to My Arcade. However, I purchased one at my local game store and it didn't work and I had to return it. There are links to these adapters in the video description. Or you can just get a Japanese Famicom system such as the 8-bit Famicom, but that's a different video. How to play Super Famicom games on a Super Nintendo or clone systems. For the Super Nintendo, Nintendo put even less effort into international region lockout by just changing the cartridge shape while leaving the motherboard exactly the same between the US and Japanese consoles. There are these non-essential plastic pegs or tabs on the inside of the American Super Nintendo case, and you can easily remove them. The OG method is by using needle-nose pliers to wiggle the little tabs left and right on the inside of the Super Nintendo cartridge slot until they snap off. And that's what I did back in the day. And if you want to not modify your Super Nintendo console, there even are affordable adapters out there like the ones made by My Arcade. A link to where you can buy an adapter or a video on how you can easily snap off the tabs are both linked in the video description. Clone consoles made by Hyperkin, Old School, and Retrobit just work without any modifications. Just stick in a Japanese Super Famicom games and you are good to go. Now, where can you buy import Japanese games? Sendico is a great place to start. They are an intermediary and portal site that allows Western gamers to find items on Japanese auctions or online dealers, and then you deposit yen into a virtual wallet and use it to buy and bid on items, which are then shipped locally to a Japanese warehouse until you're ready to have it shipped overseas to you. This was one of the first services that I used, and they really have one of the best search engines which can find items through multiple auction sites or dealers. It often works best to use the exact Japanese title of a game if you're looking for that particular game. Go to the Wikipedia article on the game and look for the Japanese name. It will usually be the first reference on the article, or use Google Translate. Another great place to start is j4u.co.jp. They are a game store that has an easy-to-use website and a constantly changing selection. It's quite possible to get a big box of ridiculously cheap Famicom games, and I always check them out a couple times a month to see what they have in stock because their stock is constantly rotating. Buyee is a Japanese competitor to Sendico, but they have a slightly steeper learning curve. However, they actually have an Android app, and they have really good tools that allow you to place sniper bids on Japanese auctions. Yahoo Auctions is ridiculously popular in Japan, and it's extremely difficult to compete against Japanese nerds who are awake in the early morning hours when the auctions close and will outbid you when the auctions actually end. So sniper bid auctions are a great way if you're bidding on auctions instead of buying items outright. Surugaya is a used store chain that has an amazing selection of anime and games. I love it that you can actually easily browse their games by system and publisher. They also are one of the best ways to buy hardware and controllers. They have box games if you're into that. Your local independent game shop is a good and easy place to start, but might have a limited selection. Tapper's Retro Games and Toys and the Hillsboro Retro Game Trader west of Portland, Oregon has some of the best import selections near me. I was spoiled by Pink Gorilla Games in Seattle. They are amazing, and one of the reasons why I'm into import games. I don't recommend eBay or other online retailers since their prices are quite high. Third-party sellers on Amazon do not ship overseas, so they're not an option. International shipping. International shipping cost is quite a bit more than domestic US shipping, but you can negate this by placing larger orders and bundling them together. Because of this, I'm never just buying 1 or 2 games, but rather 10 to 20 games at a time. So when I finally get my shipment of import games, it's a cause for celebration. Personally, I like FedEx better than DHL, but DHL is quite good too. Both have pretty good tracking options. Japan Post is quite good as well. Pirate and bootleg games. With the exception of the one time that I knowingly got a labeled reproduction of an expensive Japanese cart on Sendico, I have never, to my knowledge, received a bootleg version of any of the Japanese game retailers that I mentioned or linked in the description. Fun fact, the Japanese euphemism for bootleg reproduction cart is overseas manufacture, as if it was made in China or elsewhere. I still love my bootleg version of Final Fight Tough that I got for $20. We just barely scratched the surface about why I love collecting Japanese classic retro video game cartridges. Like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. This has been 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome, play retro. Really? Really? Uh-huh. What do you think about variety in Famicom cartridges? What a cat.